Imagine a massive corporate monopoly, like, let's say, a legacy telecommunications giant that has just utterly dominated the market for, I don't know, exactly 100 years.
Right, a total monopoly.
Exactly. Generations of customers have just walked into their stores, unquestioningly bought the exact same product, and the executives haven't had to break a sweat in decades. They just assume they're invincible.
Yeah, they're practically asleep at the wheel.
Right. And then in a single day, they are completely destroyed. Not by a traditional rival, but by, two scrappy startups using aggressive, hyper-targeted tactics the monopoly didn't even know existed. The establishment is just left standing in the rubble, completely in the dark, wondering where all their customers went.
I mean, that is a perfect way to visualize the sheer shock of what we are looking at today because, well, we aren't talking about telecommunications. We're talking about the British political establishment and a specific moment where the ground completely opened up beneath it.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're immersing ourselves in a source text that is, frankly, an absolute political lightning rod.
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah. We have a very detailed interview transcript from the YouTube channel Winston Marshall. And Marshall recently sat down with Matt Goodwin. He's a political scientist, pollster, and the author of a, well, highly controversial book called Suicide of a Nation.
But the real anchor of this conversation isn't just academic theory, right? It's Goodwin's firsthand experience running as a candidate for the Reform UK Party in the recent Gorton and Denton parliamentary by-election.
Exactly. And right at the top, we need to be incredibly clear with you, the listener, about what we're actually doing here today.
Yeah, crucial point. Because this source material contains claims about demographics, religion, immigration, and, well, the fundamental integrity of Western elections that are deeply sensitive.
Highly polarizing stuff.
Very. And our job today isn't to tell you if Matt Goodwin is right or wrong. We are not taking a left-wing or a right-wing stance here.
Absolutely not. We aren't here to endorse or condemn his worldview. Instead, think of us as, like, your analytical microscope. We are going to put these arguments on the slide, dial in the focus, and help you understand the exact mechanics of what Goodwin is claiming.
Right, the specific data points he and Marshall are wielding, and the broader narrative they're constructing. Because regardless of how you vote, understanding the anatomy of these arguments is absolutely crucial to understanding the flashpoints of modern global politics.
So let's start with that monopoly disruption you mentioned. We have to understand the specific battlefield where this took place, the constituency of Gorton and Denton in Greater Manchester.
Right, and to call this a safe seat for the Labour Party is, well, it's a massive understatement.
Let's unpack the history of that, because safe seat doesn't really capture the gravity. In the UK parliamentary system, you vote for a local representative, and this specific geographic area had been held by the Labour Party for a century.
A full 100 years.
100 years. That means through the Great Depression, the Second World War, the Cold War, the dawn of the Internet, the people in this area consistently voted Labour. It was just baked into the cultural DNA of the community.
Yeah, in British politics, regions like this are often deeply tied to historical industries, working-class union allegiances and generational loyalties. The assumption by the political class is that you could put a red rosette, that's the Labour Party's color, on a lamppost in Gorton and Denton, and it would win the election.
Right, the lamppost would win.
Exactly. But Goodwin went into this specific by-election to test the very theories he wrote about in his book. He wanted to see if the establishment was actually as secure as it thought it was.
And the results were an absolute earthquake. I mean, let's look at the numbers cited in the source, because they defy almost every conventional model of British politics. Labour, the 100-year incumbent, that presumed invincible monopoly, didn't just lose.
No, they didn't.
They were beaten into third place.
And it gets worse for the establishment. Because the Conservative Party, the Tories, who traditionally make up the other half of that dominant British political duopoly, they performed so abysmally that they lost their deposit.
Wow. For those unfamiliar with UK electoral rules, can you explain the deposit thing?
Yeah, sure. So a candidate has to pay a fee to run, and they only get that money back if they secure a minimum threshold of the total vote, which is usually 5%. Falling below that is considered like the ultimate political humiliation.
And the Tories didn't even hit the minimum.
They didn't even hit it.
So if the two legacy giants completely collapsed, who actually took the spoils? Well, the Green Party won the seat with an astonishing 40% of the vote. And Matt Goodwin, representing the insurgent right-wing Populist Party, Reform UK, came in second with 28.7%.
Right, and he notes in the interview that this more than doubled his party's previous vote share in that specific area.
Which is wild.
It is. The historical rarity of this outcome is what makes Goodwin view this as a microcosm for the future. The source actually quotes Sir John Curtis, who is arguably the most respected polling expert in the UK.
What did he say?
Well, Curtis pointed out that this by-election was only the second time since 1945, since the end of the Second World War, that two parties other than Labour and the Tories finished in the top two spots in a parliamentary race.
So it's a total system shock. But what's genuinely fascinating isn't just the fact that the two startup parties won, it's the mechanism of how they won.
Yeah, the how is everything here.
Because Goodwin doesn't walk away from this saying, wow, the voters really resonated with the Green Party's environmental platform. He alleges something far more systemic and controversial. He claims he watched the death of traditional British politics and the rise of what he calls sectarian politics.
Right. And we really need to define sectarian politics exactly as Goodwin uses it in this text, because it's the foundation of his entire argument.
Let's do it.
He defines it as a political environment where tribal, ethnic, and religious allegiances completely override any consideration of the broader national interest. He argues that voters are no longer acting as individuals weighing national, economic, or social policies.
Right.
Instead, they are being mobilized as homogeneous, isolated blocs based purely on their religious or ethnic identity.
And he points the finger squarely at the Green Party for aggressively exploiting this.
Yeah.
I mean, he claims they basically threw the traditional playbook out the window. According to the interview, the Greens weren't out there exclusively talking about carbon emissions or public transport.
Far from it.
Yeah. Goodwin details them campaigning heavily in Urdu and Punjabi. He talks about them sending out Ramadan cards specifically targeted at Muslim households, focusing their efforts almost entirely around local mosques and working with community elders to secure block votes.
He highlights one specific leaflet that he found particularly egregious.
Oh, the Modi one.
Yes. Goodwin claims the Green Party distributed campaign materials, like leaflets and videos, featuring Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, meeting with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
Okay, let's pause and dissect the strategy behind that specific leaflet. Why Modi? What is the mechanical political calculation there?
It's highly calculated. Narendra Modi is a Hindu nationalist leader who is incredibly polarizing, particularly among Muslim populations globally, due to his government's policies in India regarding Kashmir and the treatment of Muslim minorities.
Right.
So by showing the Labour leader shaking hands with Modi, Goodwin argues the Green Party was executing a hyper-local sectarian wedge strategy. They were deliberately trying to pit local Muslim voters in Greater Manchester against Hindu voters.
Essentially saying, Labour supports Modi, therefore Labour is anti-Muslim, you must vote Green to oppose this.
Exactly. It has absolutely nothing to do with British domestic policy. It is entirely about importing foreign religious conflicts to secure a local voting bloc.
That is a fascinating, if aggressive, strategy. But if we stop there, a skeptic might just say, well, that's just bare-knuckle modern political campaigning. You target the demographics that live in your area with the issues they actually care about.
Right, getting out the vote.
Yeah. However, the source material moves from anecdotal complaints about campaign leaflets to a truly startling structural allegation about what happened inside the polling stations. They introduce a report from a group called Democracy Volunteers.
This is a crucial pivot in the interview. We need to clarify who Democracy Volunteers are, too. The text describes them as an independent, impartial organization.
So they aren't partisan.
Right. They are not a partisan think tank or a rival political campaign. They are officially granted access by the UK Electoral Commission to go inside the actual polling stations to observe the mechanics of the vote and ensure democratic standards are met.
And what they reported from this specific by-election is genuinely jaw-dropping. According to the source, Democracy Volunteers reported observing a phenomenon called family voting in 68% of the polling stations they monitored.
Let's define the mechanics of family voting, because honestly, it sounds rather benign, like a family taking a trip to the polls together.
It sounds lovely, right?
It does, but in this context, it means coercive voting. It describes a scenario where a dominant figure in the household, usually a husband, father, or community elder, goes into the polling station and explicitly dictates to the rest of the family members exactly how to mark their ballots.
Wow.
Yeah, often literally watching over their shoulder to ensure compliance.
Wait, hold on. I want to make sure I'm grasping the scale of this. Two-thirds of the polling stations, 68%, in a modern Western democracy.
That's what the report claims.
That sounds like a statistic you would expect from a deeply flawed democratic transition in a post-conflict state, not Greater Manchester. How is that physically happening with official poll workers standing right there in the room?
That absolute shock you're expressing is exactly what Marshall and Goodwin are trying to convey. The report claims this coercive family voting affected 1 in every 8 voters in that election.
1 in 8.
That is over 12% of the electorate having their vote actively supervised or dictated by a family member. To put that into perspective, Democracy Volunteers noted that during the local elections in 2023, they observed this phenomenon at a rate of roughly 3%. So it has just exploded in frequency.
And Goodwin argues this is a direct violation of the fundamental architecture of Western democracy. I mean, he specifically cites the Ballot Secrecy Act of 2023. The entire premise of our electoral system is the secret ballot.
Exactly, the freedom to choose.
The idea that you have absolute freedom of conscience, shielded from the eyes of your community, your employer, or even your spouse. You go into that little booth, you draw the curtain, and you are totally autonomous.
Right. Marshall backs this up with an incredibly poignant on-the-ground anecdote, actually. He mentions that during the campaign, he visited a household where he spoke to 3 women. They explicitly told him they knew absolutely nothing about the politics or the candidates. Yeah, their husbands simply told them which way they were going to vote. There was zero individual democratic agency.
What was the Green Party's defense against this? Because being accused of benefiting from widespread electoral coercion is a massive charge.
Well, Marshall quotes the Green Party's official response directly. They entirely dismissed the Democracy Volunteers report and Goodwin's allegations, just calling it a desperate attempt to undermine a legitimate democratic result.
Really?
Yeah, they literally compared Goodwin's complaints to the Trump playbook, implying he was just a sore loser trying to invent fraud to explain away his defeat.
So we have a complete breakdown in the shared reality of what constitutes a fair election. But Goodwin takes this household-level coercion and scales it up. He connects it to a much larger systemic theory of voting behavior centered around what he calls clan-based or biradari networks.
Biradari is a crucial term to unpack here. It roughly translates from Urdu to brotherhood or clan. It refers to highly structured, patriarchal kinship networks that are common in South Asia and have been transplanted into diaspora communities in the UK. Goodwin alleges that these networks do not operate on individualistic voting principles. Instead, decisions are made collectively by community elders.
How does that actually function in a campaign, mechanically speaking? Like, how do the votes get delivered?
According to Goodwin, it's a system of backroom brokering. A political party will approach the elders of a biradari network. They'll strike a deal, perhaps promising funding for a local community center, favorable zoning for a mosque, or simply influence and access.
Right. Basic political horse trading.
Exactly. But once the deal is struck, the elders pass the instruction down through the clan network. The community is voting for this candidate. And Goodwin claims this isn't theoretical. He says he was approached halfway through this very campaign by individuals who bluntly told him a deal had been struck to back the Greens, and his campaign in those neighborhoods was effectively over.
Wow. And he argues that political parties, and he singles out the Labor Party historically, dating back to Tony Blair's era, have been perfectly happy to entertain and exploit these clan-based blocs for decades. Because it's an incredibly efficient way to harvest thousands of votes without having to win over individuals one by one.
It's the path of least resistance.
Exactly. But now, the Green Party has hijacked that exact same network to beat Labor at their own game.
And this naturally bridges us into the structural mechanics of the voting system itself. Because if Goodwin is raising alarm bells about 68% of polling stations witnessing coercion in plain sight of impartial observers and police, he is infinitely more terrified of what is happening outside the polling station, specifically the massive proliferation of postal votes.
This is where we get into what I like to call the legacy code of the British electoral system. Think of the UK voting system as an old, established software program. It was built decades ago for a specific type of user behavior, operating on assumptions of high trust and individual autonomy.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it.
But now, according to Goodwin, that legacy code is being accessed by new users who are exploiting it in ways the original programmers never foresaw.
And postal voting is the ultimate vulnerability in that legacy code. In the Gorton and Denton by-election, roughly 14,000 postal votes were sent out to people's homes.
14,000.
Nigel Farage, the leader of Reform UK, is heavily referenced in this segment of the interview. His argument, which Goodwin echoes, is based on simple logic. If widespread coercion is happening right in front of electoral monitors at the polling booth, the potential for unchecked coercion in the complete privacy of a household is exponentially higher.
Right, because if the elder of a beer dairy network wants to ensure compliance, they don't even need to send a husband to supervise the wives in the booth.
No, not at all.
They could just have all the postal ballots in the household, or even an entire apartment block brought to the kitchen table or a community center and filled out en masse. The secret ballot is completely obliterated.
And Goodwin traces the mainstreaming of postal voting directly back to Tony Blair's government. Historically, postal voting in the UK was a narrow exception.
Right, you had to have a real reason.
Exactly. You had to prove a legitimate reason you couldn't make it to the polls, like a severe disability, being genuinely elderly, or serving overseas in the military. But Blair's government changed the law to allow postal voting on demand, meaning anyone could request one for any reason, theoretically, to increase overall voter turnout.
But Goodwin views that change as a disastrous mistake that basically opened the door to industrial-scale vote harvesting in these clan-based communities. His proposed fix is immediate and drastic. He wants to rip that legacy code out entirely and revert to the old system.
Yeah, he and Farage are demanding that postal voting be strictly restricted back to those narrow exceptions: the disabled, the elderly, and the military. If you don't fall into those categories, you must show up in person with photo ID.
But postal votes are only one part of the structural loopholes they discuss. The interview then pivots to another piece of electoral legacy code that I think will genuinely shock listeners who aren't steeped in the minutiae of UK electoral law: Commonwealth voting rights.
I have to admit, when I first looked at this, it's pretty staggering.
Yeah. When I read this part of the source, I actually have to go back and reread it to make sure I was understanding it correctly. Let's explain how this works, because it sounds completely counterintuitive to how most modern nation-states operate.
It really does. So in almost every country in the world, if you immigrate, you cannot vote in national elections until you undergo the years-long process of becoming a full naturalized citizen.
Right.
But the UK has a unique hangover from the days of the British Empire. If you move to the UK from a non-Commonwealth country, say the United States or Japan, you cannot vote. However, if you move from one of the 56 countries that make up the Commonwealth nations like India, Pakistan, Nigeria, or Australia, you are legally granted full voting rights in UK parliamentary elections the exact moment you become a resident.
Wait, really? You do not need to be a British citizen.
I do not need to be a British citizen.
That is wild. And Marshall brings up some staggering estimates from the Pimlico Journal regarding the sheer scale of this loophole. They estimate that there are currently roughly 2.5 million people residing in Britain who are citizens of Commonwealth nations, but not British citizens, who are legally eligible to vote.
To contextualize that, 2.5 million people is larger than the entire population of some smaller European countries.
Right.
And of those eligible, they estimate about 1.5 to 1.6 million are actually actively registered to vote right now.
Marshall connects this explicitly to recent immigration trends. He talks about the Boris wave, referring to the massive spike in legal immigration under former Prime Minister Boris Johnson following the COVID-19 pandemic and Brexit. Marshall points out that a highly significant portion of this recent demographic wave comes from Pakistan and India.
So if you combine these two massive structural realities, the ability to vote without citizenship and the alleged exploitation of postal voting by clan-based networks, you start to see exactly why Goodwin and Farage feel the system is rigged against the native population.
Yeah, the math starts to paint a specific picture.
Exactly. Goodwin states plainly in the interview that fixing these democratic loopholes is an existential prerequisite. He says if they don't fix the democracy by restricting voting rights strictly to actual British citizens and brutally clamping down on family voting, they simply won't save the country.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time under the hood looking at the mechanics of how the voting is happening, the specific loopholes being exploited. If you have a system full of these legacy vulnerabilities, the immediate next question is, who is actually organized enough to exploit them?
Right.
Goodwin claims that what we are witnessing is the formation of a very specific and highly contradictory new political coalition.
He spends a lot of time analyzing the Green Party's voter base in these contested areas. Remember, the Greens traditionally conjure up images of, environmental activists fighting climate change.
Tree huggers, right.
Exactly. But Goodwin describes their new winning coalition as an incredibly volatile hybrid. He breaks it down into three distinct groups: Local minority voters, primarily Muslim voters, deeply focused on foreign policy, specifically the conflict in Gaza. Then you have university students, and finally, what he broadly terms woke progressives.
I look at that alliance, and I think of it like a corporate merger between two companies that are actively suing each other. It just makes zero sense on paper. Goodwin literally calls this coalition a Trojan horse. He points out the glaring, almost comical ideological contradictions between these groups.
The contradictions are severe. Goodwin notes that the official Green Party platform advocates for the decriminalization or legalization of hard drugs, including crack cocaine and heroin. Furthermore, they are staunchly supportive of highly progressive gender ideologies and LGBTQ plus rights. Now, Goodwin looks at that platform and then looks at the Muslim bloc voters backing the party, and he argues there is an irreconcilable clash.
Yeah, I can see where he's going with that.
He asserts that these socially conservative, deeply religious Muslim communities would be fundamentally appalled by the legalization of crack cocaine or progressive gender teachings in their schools.
He provides a really stark anecdote to highlight this friction playing out in real time, too. He mentions that just days after the Green Party secured these massive electoral victories, the deputy leader of the Greens was seen attending a major protest in London.
Yes, and while organizers framed it as a broad anti-war protest, Goodwin points out that a significant faction of the crowd was actively protesting in support of the Iranian regime. Goodwin asks a devastatingly simple question here. How does the progressive, LGBTQ plus friendly wing of the Green Party square the circle of their deputy leader marching alongside supporters of a theocratic regime in Iran where gay men are routinely executed? It is a massive cognitive dissonance.
Which raises the obvious question, and Marshall essentially asks it. If this Jenga tower of a coalition is built out of drastically different cultural blocks that despise each other's core values, united only by a shared frustration with the labor establishment, won't it just collapse on its own? Like, which piece gets pulled out first?
Well, Goodwin's analysis is incredibly cynical, but strategically astute. He predicts that the Jenga tower won't accidentally collapse. It will be deliberately dismantled.
Deliberately.
Yes. He believes the sectarian bloc voting element, the religious conservatives, know exactly what they're doing. He predicts that in the long run, the woke progressives, and he explicitly names left-wing commentators like Owen Jones and the Green politicians themselves, will simply be pushed off the bus.
Just discarded.
Exactly. His theory is that the sectarian networks are using the progressives as useful idiots to gain access to the levers of local power, and once they have a firm grip, the progressive agenda will be instantly discarded.
Contrast that highly volatile merger with the coalition Goodwin claims Reform UK is building. Because there's a very dominant media narrative that Reform is purely an ethno-nationalist party, a refuge exclusively for the disgruntled white working-class voter who feels left behind by globalization.
Right, and Goodwin acknowledges the reality that the white working class in Denton went overwhelmingly for reform. But he pushes back aggressively against the idea that they are exclusively an ethno-nationalist movement. He argues they are building a culturally conservative coalition that transcends race.
Interesting.
To prove this, he details his own experiences canvassing on the streets during the campaign. He talks about campaigning alongside British Nigerians.
Okay, let's unpack that. Why would British Nigerians gravitate toward a right-wing populist party? What is the mechanism there?
According to Goodwin, it's about shared religious and cultural foundations. He claims these Nigerian voters told him they moved to the UK because they valued Britain's Christian heritage and its traditional social fabric.
Ah, I see.
They feel that Judeo-Christian foundation is under assault by progressive secularism, and they view Reform as the only party actually defending it. He also mentions British Sikhs canvassing with his team.
What's their motivation, according to him?
He points out that the Sikh community is driven by profound concerns over uncontrolled immigration and specific historical tensions, explicitly mentioning Sikh opposition to Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs that have plagued several northern English towns.
So Goodwin is essentially arguing that while the Green Party has built a fragile alliance of convenience based on disparate, single-issue grievances, Reform is building a highly sustainable, geographically efficient coalition united by a deep, shared cultural conservatism. They are united by a desire to prioritize the host nation's traditional values above all else.
Exactly. He views the Green base as hyper-concentrated and ultimately doomed to infighting, whereas he sees Reform's base as a broad, durable alliance of anyone, regardless of race, who wants to defend a specific vision of British national identity.
And this discussion of national identity brings us to the absolute core of Goodwin's book, and frankly, the most fiercely debated, explosive segment of the source text. If you thought the arguments over postal voting were contentious, this is where we dive into the deep end of demographic data.
Yes, this is the core of it.
Goodwin's entire worldview in Suicide of a Nation relies heavily on mathematical projections about the future makeup of Britain. I want to frame this very carefully for you listening. We are looking at how statistics are wielded to tell a narrative of unprecedented transformation.
Right. We're looking at official government data, specifically from the Office for National Statistics, or ONS, which is the recognized executive office of the UK Statistics Authority.
So these aren't just made-up numbers.
No, these are official projections. Goodwin uses them to paint a picture of a nation undergoing a demographic shift that is unparalleled in modern history. The headline claim he makes is that by the year 2063, the white British majority will officially become a minority in the UK.
The 74-year projection he lays out is staggering when you break down the math. He claims that over this period, the white British share of the population will plummet from 73% down to 33%.
That's a massive drop.
Yeah. Conversely, the share of people who are foreign-born, or the children of foreign-born immigrants, will skyrocket from 19% to over 60%. And he specifically highlights the growth of followers of Islam, projecting a rise from about 6% of the population today to roughly 25%, meaning 1 in 4 people in Britain will be Muslim.
It is vital to discuss the terminology Goodwin uses to describe this shift because it is highly charged. He explicitly uses the word replacement.
Yeah, that's a loaded word.
Very. Now, Winston Marshall rightfully challenges him on this directly in the interview. Marshall points out that the Great Replacement theory is widely condemned as a far-right, racist conspiracy theory, often associated with white supremacist dog whistles.
But Goodwin does not back down at all. He defends his use of the term vigorously, arguing that it ceases to be a conspiracy theory if it is an empirical mathematical reality happening in real time, backed by the government's own statistical office.
Right, he's saying look at the numbers.
But here's where he goes a step further. He doesn't just describe this demographic shift as a passive, accidental byproduct of globalization. He explicitly calls it a project. He alleges it was intentional.
Yes. To substantiate that claim of intentionality, he points the finger directly at the election of Tony Blair's new Labour government in 1997. Goodwin references a highly controversial but very real historical quote from a man named Andrew Neither.
Who was that?
Neither was a former speechwriter and advisor for Tony Blair. Years after leaving government, Neither wrote an article where he essentially admitted that the massive expansion of immigration under New Labour wasn't just an economic policy.
What was it then?
It was a deliberate social engineering tactic designed to, quote, rub the right's nose in diversity and permanently alter the political landscape of the country.
Wow. For Goodwin, that quote is the smoking gun. He argues that the political elite intentionally flooded the country with new demographics to break the cultural power of the conservative establishment. He throws out a historical comparison to hammer home the sheer velocity of this change.
What's the comparison?
He claims that in every single year since 1997, Britain has experienced more net immigration than in the combined 1,500 years stretching from the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons all the way to the end of the Second World War.
If we pull back and look at the bigger picture, this entire debate comes down to how different political factions interpret rapid change. Goodwin argues that those on the progressive left demand that this demographic transformation be celebrated. They view it as a natural, beautiful evolution of a modern, interconnected, globalized society.
I think of it like looking at a time-lapse video of a massive ancient forest over a century. One person watches that footage and sees natural ecological evolution. New, exotic types of trees taking root, creating a more diverse, vibrant canopy. It's progress.
Right.
But Goodwin looks at that exact same time-lapse and sees the intentional, systematic uprooting of an ancient ecosystem, replacing it with entirely different flora that fundamentally alters the soil and might not even survive the local climate.
That is exactly how he views it, and he is deeply, profoundly pessimistic about the survival of that ecosystem. He does not believe this ends in a peaceful, multicultural utopia. He actually compares the future of Britain to Lebanon and Sierra Leone.
Okay, when he mentions Lebanon, my mind immediately goes to the devastating civil war in the 1970s and 80s and the ongoing sectarian paralysis of their government today. Is Goodwin genuinely implying that the UK is heading for armed factional violence just because it lacks a 50% majority demographic?
Yeah.
Because that seems like an enormous leap of logic.
He is absolutely implying that the risk is real. To back this up, he references a conversation he had with Gad Saad. He's an evolutionary psychologist who originally fled Lebanon as a child.
Okay.
Saad warned him that Britain is actively cultivating the exact same inbuilt divisiveness and sectional interests that tore Lebanon apart. Goodwin points to a fascinating geopolitical statistic. 80% of all countries worldwide have a very clear dominant majority group.
So his argument is that a dominant demographic acts as an essential anchor for national stability.
Precisely. He argues that historically and empirically, nations simply do not function smoothly without a dominant host culture to set the rules of the game. He fears that a nation without a clear majority inevitably devolves into an endless zero-sum sectarian conflict over resources, political power, and cultural dominance. If everyone is a minority, politics becomes tribal warfare.
So if that is his dire diagnosis, that Britain is actively committing demographic and cultural suicide,
Right.
what is the prescription? How do Goodwin and Marshall propose to hit the brakes on a demographic shift of this magnitude? This leads them into a fierce, fundamental philosophical debate over how a nation should handle newcomers, assimilation versus integration.
Winston Marshall introduces a brilliant historical parallel to frame this discussion. He brings up the United States Immigration Act of 1924.
So let's contextualize that. Prior to 1924, the U.S. experienced the massive Ellis Island wave of immigration. Millions upon millions of Jewish, Italian, Irish, and Eastern European immigrants pouring into cities like New York and Chicago.
Right. And society was fraying under the rapid cultural changes. So the U.S. government essentially slammed on the brakes. The 1924 Act instituted a massive, multi-decade pause on mass immigration. Marshall argues that this drastic 40-year pause is exactly what gave those incredibly distinct, disparate groups the necessary breathing room to intermarry, learn the language, adopt American civic values, and actually become part of the unified American fabric.
And Goodwin wants a modern British equivalent of that 1924 Act, but with even more severe mechanisms. His specific policy demands are sweeping and unapologetic. He wants to end mass uncontrolled immigration entirely. He advocates for the UK immediately leaving the ECHR.
We should probably explain the ECHR for a second, the European Convention on Human Rights.
Yeah, good call.
For listeners outside of Europe, think of this as an overarching international treaty and court system that often supersedes local UK law, particularly regarding who can and cannot be deported. Goodwin views the ECHR as an intolerable set of handcuffs on British sovereignty that prevents them from deporting illegal migrants and foreign criminals.
He also wants to ruthlessly cut off welfare benefits and access to social housing for absolutely anyone who isn't a full British citizen. But beyond the hard economic policies, the deeper debate is purely philosophical. It's about what society demands from the people who live within its borders. Goodwin entirely rejects the concept of integration.
He calls it a weak, meaningless word.
Yeah, he doesn't want integration, he demands assimilation.
Let's challenge you, the listener, to really define the difference between those two concepts in your own mind, because the distinction is profound.
Think of it like this. Is society meant to be a bento box? In a bento box, you have different foods, the rice, the fish, the pickled vegetables, all sitting side by side in the same container. They share the same space, but they remain totally distinct, never touching, never altering each other's fundamental flavor. That is multicultural integration.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Or is society meant to be a stew? Everything goes into one massive pot, the heat is turned up, and the ingredients melt together into a single, unified, entirely new flavor. That is assimilation.
Goodwin explicitly demands the stew. He argues that the bento box model has been a catastrophic failure. In a bento box society, minority groups are encouraged to prioritize their own origin identity, their own foreign conflicts, and their own religious laws at the expense of the host nation's defining values.
Right.
Assimilation, in his view, is a non-negotiable contract. Immigrants must actively prioritize and adopt the host nation's culture over the culture they left behind.
And he lays out very specific, aggressive cultural demands to force the ingredients into the stew. First, he wants to end the £300 million a year the British government spends on translation services in the public sector.
Yeah, that's a big one.
The mechanism here is simple. If you remove the safety net of translation for accessing healthcare or local government, you forcefully compel people to learn English, creating a shared language.
He also demands a total, uncompromising ban on Sharia courts operating in any capacity within the UK. He wants to legally end the cultural practice of cousin marriage, which directly links back to our earlier discussion of breaking the power of the Biradari clan-based voting networks, as those networks are often cemented through arranged cousin marriages.
Perhaps most passionately, he is fiercely opposed to what he calls the creeping rise of backdoor blasphemy laws.
This is an incredibly raw nerve in British public life right now. Goodwin references the fact that the Labour Party is working on creating a new, formal definition of anti-Muslim hostility and has floated appointing an anti-Muslim hate czar.
Right.
Goodwin links this political capitulation directly to a chilling, real-world consequence. He brings up the case of a teacher at Batley Grammar School in West Yorkshire.
We have to highlight this case because it illustrates exactly what Goodwin fears. Several years ago, a teacher at this school showed a cartoon picture of the Prophet Muhammad during a religious studies class about blasphemy and free speech. Following massive protests outside the school by local Muslim groups, the teacher was suspended, received death threats, and had to flee his home.
Yeah.
Reportedly, 5 years later, he is still in hiding.
Goodwin looks at that situation and sees the ultimate failure of the state. He sees a government and a police force capitulating to the sectarian demands of a religious minority, effectively allowing de facto blasphemy laws to be violently enforced on British soil, rather than fiercely defending the British tradition of free speech.
Winston Marshall pushes back here with a truly fascinating theological counterargument. He asks Goodwin, if you are demanding complete unflinching allegiance to the nation and its laws above all else, you are going to run into trouble with devout Christians too. Because Christianity, at its core, inherently commands believers to put God above the nation.
It is a very sharp intellectual trap. But Goodwin's counter is that while Britain's entire moral architecture is fundamentally built on a Christian foundation, modern Christianity operates completely differently from political Islam.
How so?
Well, Goodwin argues that Christians in the UK are not demanding the fusion of church and state. They aren't trying to subordinate women's rights in the public sphere, and they certainly aren't issuing death threats to enforce blasphemy laws against cartoonists.
He contrasts that civic compatibility of Christianity with a survey he cites regarding the Muslim population. He claims data shows that over 70% of British Muslims identify as Muslim first and British second.
Wow.
Yeah. For Goodwin, that statistic is the terrifying empirical proof that the multicultural bento box has failed, and that a massive segment of the population holds allegiances that supersede the nation-state itself.
So, as we pull all of these complex incendiary threads together, what we have explored today is a stark, uncompromising worldview. Matt Goodwin and Winston Marshall are outlining a belief that the very foundations of traditional British democracy, from the literal mechanics of the secret ballot to the overarching demographic makeup of the nation, are actively fracturing.
Yeah.
They see a system buckling under the weight of uncontrolled mass migration, the rise of aggressive sectarian voting blocs, and a legacy political elite that is either too naive or too complicit to stop it.
And why should you, the listener, care about this, regardless of whether you live in London, Los Angeles, or Sydney? Because the underlying tension we just spent an hour unpacking is absolutely not unique to the United Kingdom. How a modern, hyper-diverse democracy manages violently competing cultural values, secures the fundamental integrity of its voting systems against new technological and demographic pressures, and defines its core national identity.
Right.
These are the defining political puzzles of the 21st century for every democracy on Earth.
These are the pressure points that will dictate the political earthquakes of the next 50 years.
Which leaves us with a profound, lingering question to ponder long after you finish listening to this deep dive. If we accept the premise that a nation in the 21st century can no longer rely on a single overwhelming demographic majority or a totally uniform historical culture, what is the actual glue that holds a modern democracy together?
It's the big question.
Is a shared commitment to a sterile legal and economic framework enough to keep a society from fracturing? Or, as Goodwin argues, does a country truly need a shared collective memory, a shared cultural stew, just to survive?
It is a question without an easy answer, but one that is coming for all of us.
Like we said at the beginning, the legacy monopoly has been shattered. The old rules no longer apply. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.